There is a nation state which has declared war on all of Western-style democracy. And I think it's incumbent upon people who have some understanding of the problem to do what they can to help people fight back, to take the battle to the enemy.
The COVID-19 pandemic has made the transnational nature of disinformation crystal clear. Conspiracies about the virus's origins in one country surface across the Atlantic in an instant.
When we look back in 2016, despite many warnings from the expert community and despite a number of elections and referenda targeted by Kremlin's information aggression in Europe, the whole Europe was actually extremely passive in its policy solutions, and it started only with some more significant activity after the US elections in 2016 and the media attention around that.
Initially, the way we addressed the threat of disinformation was from a defensive posture. Just how do we protect ourselves? How do we root out the bad actors and the potential harms online? And more recently, I think it has progressed to the point of how do we do so in a way that doesn't undermine some of the core values that are essential to our democracy.
The top priority for the Transatlantic digital agenda should be to establish a common set of guidelines and rules around data privacy and use that is rooted in democratic values and principles.
We know that it is a challenge. We have acknowledged it. And so you see now a lot more of the civil society, government, and industry working together to address the challenge.
Hello, and welcome back to CEPA Forum. If you're just tuning in, my name is Geisha Gonzalez, and I'm the Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. Welcome to Day 4 of our CEPA Forum, Mapping the Transatlantic Agenda, a Digital Agenda. It is my pleasure to thank our supporters, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Bell Helicopter, NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, and American Friends of Czech Republic. For those of you that are following the discussion, please use hashtag CEPA Forum or go to cepaforum.org to submit your questions. And now to kick off today's discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, in conversation with the founder of Craigslist and Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Craig Newmark. Over to you, Alina.
So, Craig, I think most people know you as the founder of Craigslist, but you have become a philanthropist in more recent years. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you went from being the founder of Craigslist to now being so engaged in philanthropy?
Well, Craigslist, from one point of view, is about helping people put food on the table, helping people get a table, helping people find a roof under which to put the table. That is not philanthropy, but it does involve a spirit of connection to people and helping each other out. So as I became increasingly useless at Craigslist, I found myself becoming useful in philanthropy because I figured the business model of Craigslist, doing well by doing good, worked out better than we thought it would. So as a result, I had discretionary income to give away, and I'm trying to give it away in a manner that's most effective. That's the transition to philanthropy. The model is find something which I think is important and perhaps underserved, and then help out by sharing power and resources and money with groups who are already doing a good job, and then I mostly get out of their way. I will help with communications. I will remind them to stay safe, which is a concern in a number of areas, and I will ask them to be patient with my sense of humor.
So the Newmark Foundation has been supporting a really wide range of groups and causes. How do you decide the issues and the groups that you want to contribute to? And can you tell us a little bit more perhaps about a few of your grantees whose work you find really impactful and interesting?
The way I find things is that I look at who has really good reputations in specific areas, who are reputedly getting a lot done. Then I've done a lot of research to locate those groups who are doing that kind of work. Once that happens, among the groups I support, I can find people who can consolidate efforts for me, who can understand the landscape of that particular part of philanthropy, and then they can give me advice on other groups to work with, therefore forming networks of networks. One good example of this, serving military families and military veterans, is that's the Bob Woodruff Foundation. And they've actually built across the US a network of networks of charitable organizations doing work on the ground who are actually effective. I'm doing this now with the International Women's Media Foundation. Their focus is on dealing with harassment, most specifically directed towards journalists and female journalists who get the worst of it. When it comes to cybersecurity, my focus there is the Aspen Cybersecurity Group. When it comes to underserved communities in news media, I'm working with the Black Media Initiative within the CUNY, the City University of New York Journalism School. So again, I find people doing good work, which I think where they need a little extra help, share resources, give away power, but I do tell them that I will bug them about communicating better. I will bug them about their trust and safety issues because they don't think about their safety. And then also I will ask their indulgence when it comes to my sense of humor, because I know that I'm not as funny as I think I am.
Just to follow up on that, that was actually really funny. But one of the areas that you've also invested in through your philanthropic ventures has been research on counter disinformation, which is where, of course, CEPA has also been a grantee of yours as well. And I wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about why this issue specifically. How did you get interested in disinformation campaigns, and why do you think this is an important issue for you to devote resources to?
Well, there is a nation state which has declared war on all of Western-style democracy, particularly the US. They've had some success, and I think it's incumbent upon people who have some understanding of the problem to do what they can to help people fight back, to take the battle to the enemy. And so I've been taking a look at this for a few years, studying it the best I can, finding organizations who are part of the solution. This started with Jeff Jarvis at the City University of New York, handing me the Nato Handbook of Russian Information Warfare, written by Keir Giles, who's now at Chatham House. I learned a great deal from that. I've since spoken with a lot of people in a number of groups doing good work to counter information warfare across a broad spectrum. That includes the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations out of the Carnegie Endowment. I'm also working with the Election Integrity Partnership, which is led in part by folks at the Stanford Internet Observatory, like Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta. They're working with Kate Starbird out of the University of Washington. The idea is that I've been able to find a lot of people who are doing good work, but who need additional resources. And as I remind them, of course, they need to stay safe and, of course, put up with my sense of humor.
Just to follow up on that, one of the big issues that CEPA has been working on is building a community that also brings more diversity to the policy conversation on disinformation, on the broader digital agenda. In your other philanthropic work, you mentioned you work a lot with underserved, underrepresented groups. How do you see these two overlapping? The concern about giving groups who are underrepresented a seat at the table, and the work on counter disinformation, specifically state-sponsored disinformation.
In the way I view things, everything connects because I had a really good US history teacher in 1970 who, among other things, told me that a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy, and that our country aspires to values including fairness for everyone. That reaches back to my Sunday school, where we were taught that it is wrong to bear false witness. We were also taught to treat people like we want to be treated. And it took almost 50 years for me to remember what I had been taught 50 or 60 years ago. And so what I'm doing is just trying to follow through on all those principles. Those are the unifying efforts to everything that I'm doing right now. And that's what ties things together in my gut and in my head. Everything else is just follow through, being fair to people, and then helping the people who are defending our country against our foreign adversaries and their domestic allies.
Well, I think one thing that I've certainly learned from my years of working on disinformation, of what CEPA has been doing on this issue as well, is that there's a lot more that needs to be done. We're still very much at the tip of the iceberg, but it really has been profoundly transformative to see how your interest and investment in this work has given us in the nonprofit space, especially, the opportunity to do our work. And on behalf of CEPA, thank you for that. And I'm sure all the other partners you mentioned would also say the same thing. So thank you, Craig. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Alina, and thank you, Craig. I'd also like to thank the Craig Newmark Philanthropies for their support of CEPA. And now, it is my pleasure to welcome friends and colleagues that are working with us against our fight against disinformation, as they reflect on what they think should be part of the Transatlantic digital priorities and what makes them hopeful with our fight against disinformation. Then it will be over to our own President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, who will chair today's discussions.
The top priority for the Transatlantic digital agenda should be to establish a common set of guidelines and rules around data privacy and use that is rooted in democratic values and principles of transparency, integrity, and accountability.
Disinformation, more specifically breaking the global business model of disinformation, should be a top priority for the Transatlantic digital agenda. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the transnational nature of disinformation crystal clear. Conspiracies about the virus's origins in one country surface across the Atlantic in an instant. The pandemic has also made clear that disinformation online has real-world harms. Bunk cures and the rejection of lockdown measures are literally killing people. So if it is now evident that the causes of disinformation and the harms of disinformation are transnational, it should also be evident that so are the solutions. Regulations need to consider both the global reach of disinformation and the lucrative advertising business models behind it. We have many institutions which allow countries to share information and intelligence across nations. Something similar is required for the sharing of intelligence around disinformation, across platforms and countries, to allow coordinated action to prevent real-world harms.
When we talk about what our priority should be in the creation of a transatlantic digital agenda, I think there is a tendency to talk about the need for a democratic framework and greater cooperation between Europe and the United States, which of course just feels like an empty platitude. At the same time, I don't think we can address some of the specific threats in the digital arena, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, disinformation, government surveillance, without first going back to that bigger picture question, which is, what should a democratic internet look like? And I think the starting point there needs to be looking at digital rights in the same way that we look at human rights, where there actually is broad consensus between Europe and the United States. Because if we don't first establish that framework, we are going to end up with a bifurcated internet, where each country is going to create their own sovereign internet space. They'll be able to control and manipulate information, which of course leads us down the path of authoritarian countries like China and Iran.
The top priority of the Transatlantic Digital Policy Agenda should be to ensure that the way people interact and communicate with each other is not determined solely by private companies or solely by governments. The digital public sphere should serve the public interest and not corporate or governmental interests. And I think if policymakers can find a way to empower people through policies and through digital news and media literacy, that will benefit not only individual citizens, but society as a whole.
Regarding the question of the top priority for a transatlantic digital agenda, I would suggest that beginning to form one would be a good first step, holding high-level convenings around questions about the intersection of technology, social media, rights, justice, basic democratic principles, and bots, how those have come together without regulation, without consideration for security, to undermine a lot of our democratic principles and norms, things we might wish to preserve.
Everyone is talking about algorithms, data protection, ad transparency, etc. Let me highlight a different problem. I think the policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic should demand that the digital companies have a significantly tougher position against the known disinformation-oriented outlets. It isn't fair that Voice of America gets the same label as Russia Today, since they are both state-controlled media. People working in Voice of America are journalists, whereas people working in Russia Today, they are brainless soldiers in Kremlin's information war against the West. A war that is not even a secret anymore, but it is an openly declared war, both by the Kremlin and by the representatives of the pseudo-media. Vladimir Putin's information weapons shouldn't be labeled as media. They should be labeled as information weapons, the aim of which is to lie and to mislead the consumer.
I think the biggest challenge we have is actually making sure that those bad actors who are making us harm, I mean to Europe and to the United States, that they feel the consequences of their actions. Because, for example, if you look to what is Russia doing towards, for example, European democracies, murdering in Europe, creating a lot of disinformation campaigns, organizing massive surveillance, massive intelligence operations across Europe, we see that Russia doesn't face any real consequences for that. There is only symbolic action taken. And the same goes for China. We have seen actually China pushing very hard, blackmailing individual European countries. And so far the only real response from Europe has been just symbolic action, words, and no real action. So Russia and China both are hostile, both are dictatorships, and both see that they can basically do anything to European countries without facing any consequences. And I think that needs to stop.
In the past 4 years, our community has been very much more discussing than it was before on sharing information, sharing research, sharing research papers together in order to understand better the issue of disinformation. What makes me hopeful for the future is to keep this level of conversation going on, to structure more the discussions, the cooperations, and the collaboration between both sides of the Atlantics on how we can together better understand how disinformation spread also in other parts of the world.
What gives me hope is that we are just beginning to experiment at the intersection of technology and civil society, to begin engaging the millions of grassroots organizations around the world who've traditionally helped our communities and our democracies deliberate about what they care about, what their values are, what their norms are, really work out and refine the social contract. This is an enormous body of goodwill and intent that, as I said, has yet to be truly engaged, a community that we're just beginning to work with through partnerships like that between CEPA and TechSoup, Atlantic Council, and others, beginning to bring these communities in to help contextualize misinformation down to the community level through these traditional arbiters of truth in our grassroots societies is something that does give me hope and faith.
What makes us at GDI hopeful is that the pandemic has made awareness of the real-world impacts of online disinformation very stark. It has made plain the global nature of disinformation. Anti-vax content is now being stoked across the world, reducing the rates of those willing to take a COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available. And this will significantly hinder the world's ability to recover. Advertisers are starting to call for more action across the platforms and the advertising technology system to prevent their advertising dollars inadvertently funding disinforming content. And customers are increasingly showing that they believe advertisers have a responsibility to ensure that their ad dollars are not funding harmful content online, and those customers will punish brands that do not take action.
It is actually the US elections this year. When we look back in 2016, despite many warnings from the expert community and despite a number of elections and referenda targeted by Kremlin's information aggression in Europe, the whole Europe was actually extremely passive in its policy solutions, and it started only with some more significant activity after the US elections in 2016 and the media attention around that. We are 4 years later. We see that the Americans have a number of investigations into this particular information aggression, whereas in Europe, we only had more elections and referenda attacked, but still not a single investigation similar to Robert Mueller's one. So I hope that the media attention around the US election will once again wake up some of the more reluctant European decision makers and will result into some more activity on the European continent.
So where I feel a bit optimistic is I think the conversation actually has moved in a positive direction over the past several years. Because initially, the way we addressed the threat of disinformation was from a defensive posture. Just how do we protect ourselves? How do we root out the bad actors and the potential harms online? And more recently, I think it has progressed to the point of how do we mitigate those threats, which are real, but how do we do so in a way that doesn't undermine some of the core values that are essential to our democracy, most notably the open, free flow of information.
I'm extremely hopeful on our efforts to fight and defeat the challenge of disinformation. And I'm hopeful because 5 years ago, we had to raise the alarm and continuously try to convince Brussels and Washington, D.C. that the challenge of disinformation was a challenge not just in one country or one region, but that it was a challenge for democracies around the globe. And now we don't have to do that. We know that it is a challenge. We have acknowledged it. And so you see now a lot more of the civil society, government, and industry working together to address the challenge. Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely. But at least we know that we're in this fight together and we don't have to convince people that this is a problem. And that makes me hopeful.
That the spirited actions that are already visible from a lot of people, researchers, scientists, activists, citizens themselves, can inspire policymakers and decision makers to come together as well.
And what makes me hopeful? Well, it is actually that there is so much evidence of Russian and Chinese interference in European and American democracies that it's almost impossible, I hope, to actually deny that the threat is here and action should be taken. So that makes me hopeful, while at the same time thinking, well, what else do they have to do so that we will start pushing back and start actually inflicting cost on their hostile behavior? And that should be our number one goal currently as we go on.
We have come a long way in our work to counter foreign disinformation campaigns. What gives me hope is that I see a whole of society approach emerging in which social media platforms, civil society groups, and governments are increasingly working together to share information so we can collectively start to counter foreign information influence operations.
Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. Thank you so much for that fantastic video from our community of disinformation, counter-disinformation researchers from Europe, the United States, and all over the world. Really powerful message about what we have to actually be hopeful about when it comes to countering disinformation campaigns. And thank you to Craig Newmark for that interesting conversation we had earlier. And thank you to Craig Newmark Philanthropies for their support of CEPA's work to counter disinformation and to build a more comprehensive transatlantic digital agenda. So without further ado, that is the topic we'll be talking about today. The race for digital innovation will define the shape of geopolitics, with Chinese technology companies now innovating rather than perhaps copying and mimicking Western technologies. Beijing's expansive surveillance state at home has left Europe and the United States perhaps struggling to understand how we can retain our competitive edge going forward. But at the same time, Europe and the United States are finding themselves in an increasingly large rift when it comes to how to approach tech policy and the digital agenda more broadly. So on that topic, I have a fantastic panel to discuss how do we map a transatlantic digital agenda. I'm joined today by Ian Bremmer, who is the president of the Eurasia Group, Ambassador Eileen Donahoe, who's the executive director of Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University, Casper Klinge, who is the vice president for Europe at Microsoft, and Nick Pickles, global head of public policy strategy and development at Twitter. So without further ado, Ian, let me just go directly to you. Europe has become a digital global regulator. And while the US seems to be absent from the regulatory agenda, I think the irony here, of course, is that we're in a situation now where we have the EU regulating basically primarily US companies. Is there a rift emerging between Europe and the US when it comes to policy and all things digital?
Sure. I think there's a rift, and I think it's been coming for a while. I mean, everyone here is going to talk about how the Europeans are considerably more concerned and more proactive about privacy, about the social contract more broadly, while in the United States, it's much more entrepreneurial support, pro-private sector, and willingness to let these companies, in many cases, not self-regulate, but more effectively self-regulate, and the support for lobbying dollars allowing companies to capture the regulatory environment in the U.S. is not limited to tech companies. That was made worse by all of the Snowden revelations during the Obama administration. I mean, when you're finding out that Angela Merkel's personal cell phone is being hacked illegally by the National Security Agency, doesn't exactly foster trust between the largest economy in Europe and the United States. And of course, under President Trump, who personally has relations that have been so poisoned with most of the core European leaders, even though the general alignment of the countries remains pretty strong. So yeah, there's no question that there's a rift, and the rift has been getting bigger. Having said that, I would argue that the rift between the US and Europe compared to China on tech is actually much bigger, and it's moving faster. And to the extent that a decision needs to be made by the European governments, if they have to choose between the two, they're going to choose the United States, and it's not going to be close. The analogy I would raise, and then we've got a lot of people here, so I don't want to take too much time, is look at the Iranian nuclear deal. The Americans left the Iranian nuclear deal unilaterally, and it was strongly opposed by every single American ally in Europe. It didn't want it to happen. They were angry about it. But after the Americans pulled out, all of those European countries aligned with the US policy, and they ended up not doing all of the business that had been expected and promised with Iran. Why? Because even if they don't like what the US is doing, if they have to choose and they're forced to choose, they're going to choose the United States. Now, okay, China's not Iran. I mean, clearly there's a lot more economic integration with the Chinese. It's a much bigger country, but the same basic logic holds. And that's where I think we're going on the transatlantic tech relationship.
So I think you bring up a really interesting point, Ian, that I think we'll come back to in our conversation, which is that the rift on policy, divisions on policy when it comes to European and US policy towards China is actually greater than the issues that divide us on digital policy. And I think these are obviously interrelated. As China steps up its efforts to invest in artificial intelligence, other emerging technologies, and export that model across the globe as well. And I think it's going to be interesting to discuss how are those interconnected, meaning can we have a divided digital policy, but have a coherent China policy, or do these really have to go hand in hand? Let me first take it over to some other folks in the discussion to chime in. Eileen, you have been working on tech policy for a very long time. Let me just start with a broader question. Do you think that Europe, the EU, is heading in the right direction when it comes to what we know about how the Commission and how the Union is thinking about the upcoming legislative efforts on tech regulation in particular? Are they going in the right direction from what you can tell?
So thanks for that question. Let's go right into it because that's the very provocative one from my point of view. My simple answer is no. To your previous comment, I actually think we need to be very much aligned on digital policy and digital agenda so that we can counter the threat from China. And that at the end of the day, the biggest strategic challenge the United States face, Europe faces, and the Transatlantic Alliance faces is the growing threat from China and the promotion of the model of digital authoritarianism around the world. And this is gaining traction as we fight with each other and we put so much focus on US private sector tech companies. So to me, the big need is not just for a tech regulatory framework that is rooted in human rights values, which we share. We need an entire strategic normative strategy for governing digital society that's rooted in that international human rights framework. I see that framework as the normative pillar of the post-World War II international order. That whole order is what's being threatened. And a big piece of one of the biggest causes is the digitization of society. It has basically infiltrated every area and wreaked havoc on many of our basic approaches to governance. Created so many security vulnerabilities. And I would say Europe and the United States are at odds over how we actually adhere to these human rights values in a digital context. I'm just going to say, you might as well just do it. Ian already brought up some of the faults on the US side. Obviously, Donald Trump has disrespected our allies unbelievably. He himself has retreated on all of our normative values. The US Congress is completely dysfunctional. We also have never recovered from that original sin that all the stuff revealed in the Snowden revelations. But to my eye, Europe really needs to change direction. Way too much focus on the downside risks of technology, not enough focus on the importance of technology and tech innovation. I would say it's very hard to be the global regulator of digital technology if you are not also leading on the technology itself. And this is exactly how China has gained traction. They have stepped right into that tech governance realm and are infiltrating with their norms and values. And I think that's perhaps one of the most consequential things that's happening in the world today.
That's fascinating. It's been interesting to watch how Beijing has sort of taken this vacuum in commitment to values and principles and has tried to present an alternative agenda that, of course, is not rooted in what we call values of the so-called free internet that are democratic as well, transparency, accountability, integrity, and Beijing has launched a campaign to try to get other countries signed on to this international, quote-unquote, international agenda they've laid out, while at the same time, at least this administration has pivoted aggressively to see China as a rival and to block Chinese technologies, while in Europe, we see huge divisions between EU member states on these issues. So it's not even a rift between the United States and Europe, it's also a huge rift within Europe itself. So Casper, you are joining us from Brussels, and you have seen this issue evolve over your roles inside of government when you were the first tech ambassador from Denmark to Silicon Valley. And now you're, of course, at Microsoft as their vice president for European governmental affairs. How do you see what's happening today? I mean, if we can just continue the list of divisions, the other very stark division that Eileen has mentioned, that the EU seeks to be a regulator while it's not an innovator in the technology space, is that we've seen court cases, legal battles not happening on a regular basis between US tech companies and the EU or specific European governments. Are we just going towards disorganized chaos here? Or are there places where you think we have some opportunities for cooperation, given what we've just laid out on some of the divisions we see?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So my role is to be a little bit more positive than Eileen and Ian. I take it. Listen, I think what you have to understand, and I was living in the US for 3 years. When European decision makers wake up in the morning and they look at the global map and they look at technology and digitalization, you have a big chunk of companies coming out of the US. You have increasingly a big number of technology companies coming out of Asia and specifically of China. And on that map with big technology companies, Europe is not particularly big. And the reason I'm saying this is that I think that's sort of the framework for Europeans in being deeply concerned about the future of Europe, our ability to create jobs, our ability to help sort of set the standards around the technology and digitalization. And I think the first starting point is to sort of acknowledge that that is a pretty legitimate viewpoint. And also when you look at the data sets, I think European decision makers need to focus a lot on how we move Europe into this sort of geopolitical battle between especially the US and in China. And I don't want to disagree with Ian and Eileen. Nothing good will come out of that. And I do think that what they point out is absolutely true. There is a split, and it is very easy to sort of give examples on how this political turmoil is also increasing the tension. I think techlash is part of that, and I would just throw COVID-19 into the equation because I think the dependency, especially on US technology, during COVID-19 has sort of increased these discussions around digital sovereignty that we see. But I do want to sort of point to a couple of areas where I think actually we do need to help make sure that we build bridges across the Atlantic. And by the way, in times of political turmoil, I think private companies, including Microsoft, we actually have an important and almost a responsibility to make sure we try and bridge those issues. What I would point to a couple of areas, if we take the Schrems II decision, a lot of interest around that. So basically the transfer of data between Europe and the US. Very complicated situation. There is no solution short term on this. But I think that's actually a pretty good example where the US administration together with the European Commission have worked below the radar screen to basically try and find a pragmatic way forward that would enable the transfer of data to continue. Another example I would bring forward is actually on sort of regulations or creating policies around artificial intelligence, where the US decided to endorse some principles coming out of the OECD last year. I think that's a good example of a couple of areas where we can actually help foster some collaboration across the Atlantic. Last point I just want to say is that there is, of course, a lot of focus on China, and I think also when you sit in the US, this feeling that Europe is more focused on the US than it is on the threat, if you like, from China. I think the feeling here in Europe is that we can expect more from close friends that basically share the same value set. I think that's where that feeling and perception is coming from. And again, I think we have to recognize that, and I think we have to make sure we help find solutions that will enable Europe to do better on digitalization and technology.
Oh, thank you, Casper. I was hoping you would provide us with a more optimistic view of the world. But before I go over to Nick, let me just stick with you for 1 second. You mentioned the Schrems II decision this summer. I was wondering if you could just quickly define for those who are listening and they may not be familiar with the implications of that decision as to what it means. Recently, Facebook reportedly filed a legal move, I believe in Ireland, that threatened basically that Facebook would not be able to provide its full suite of services, which of course includes Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, to European Union citizens. Partially, that's been the potential implication of the so-called Schrems decision. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that decision means for the transatlantic relationship, and why, to help us contextualize why a company like Facebook, which of course has a large user base in Europe and the EU, would potentially go that far to threaten pulling out of the entire market space altogether. Can you help us contextualize that?
I'll probably leave it to Facebook to explain, their considerations in terms of Schrems II. But the fundamental aspect of this verdict that came out a month ago is that it rendered one part of the data transfer framework, illegal. Privacy Shield. We still have something called the standard contractual clauses that enables a degree of protection around privacy issues when you transfer data between Europe and the US and vice versa. But I think, an important part of this is that there was a lot of focus on big technology companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Google, etc. But this is a fundamental problem also for small and medium-sized enterprises on both sides of the Atlantic. So this is very often used as an example of sort of disagreement between the US and Europe. I think actually when you speak to most companies, there is a fundamental interest in finding a pragmatic solution that will enable data to continue to be transferred in both directions for economic reasons, because of the opportunities of companies to continue operating their business models. But again, I think the positive side of that is that it didn't blow up. We didn't have a major sort of discussion across the Atlantic. In fact, what happened was that the European Commission sat down with the US government, said, okay, let's go to work. Let's find out what we need to do to make sure that we don't disrupt the ability to transfer data between two important continents in the world.
Thank you, Casper. I appreciate you clarifying that. Didn't mean to put you on the spot to justify to the company's potential decisions here, but I think it's important to understand why this decision has potential incredibly broad implications for some of these companies to be able to do business, or their perception to be able to do business in the European market. So Nick, with that, let me take it over to you. I often like to know that, Twitter, even though most of us here definitely use Twitter, and it's certainly been a company that's been in the hot seat over all kinds of issues related to disinformation campaigns, or so-called inauthentic coordinated behavior, data privacy, et cetera. But Twitter, of course, is not the largest company in the space by far when you compare it to Google, certainly when you compare it to Facebook. But what I think is interesting is that the company has also become an agenda setter in terms of policies on everything from limiting certain kinds of political ads, certain kinds of misleading content, labeling state-controlled outlets as being state-controlled outlets to give users some context for the information they're seeing. As platforms traverse this incredibly complex and ambiguous regulatory environment in Europe and the United States, do you think there's something that policymakers just continue to get wrong when it comes to the regulatory agenda, or are continually missing when it comes to these conversations we're having today? Nick, do we have you? Are you on mute?
It's reassuring that we are several months through working from home and I still can't figure out the mute button, which is a whole technology problem in and of itself. Thank you for the invitation to join and follow up such great speakers. I think the point that Catherine made about values actually go to the heart of this. Technology policy isn't the first policy area to be victim of political expediency. That has happened as long as politics has been around and debates about public policy. So the question that we're asking is, how do we get beyond the day-to-day? How do we stop looking at the problem that's right in front of us and think longer term? We're at the beginning of the information century. We're at the beginning of the digital century. There's a long way to go. And so how do we make policy decisions that protect the open internet for the long term? How do we make decisions that don't say the internet today is the internet that we are somehow going to try and protect and maintain going forward? The value of an open internet allows for competition. You referenced Twitter's size. Depending which meeting I'm in, I'm sometimes the smallest of the big companies or the biggest of the small companies. And so that kind of tension around things like thinking through what's the cost of compliance. So as policymakers are changing regulations, is the actual outcome of regulation making it harder for new businesses to enter the market? Are we in a situation where, to comply with certain regulations, the only companies who have the resources to do so are the 2 or 3 big companies that you named in the introduction? And the challenge you have, particularly around technology, is it's not just things like how many content moderators do you have. It's the machine learning data, the training data sets, and the models behind those systems. And so one of the challenges you have is that even if we enhance industry cooperation, which is having a big impact, policymakers regulating on the content and not on things like, well, how do we make sure that there's equal access to that proactive technology? And then how do we reconcile the tensions that policy sometimes has? So on the one hand, to take, for example, privacy, and on the other hand, the desire for companies to proactively look for certain types of content. Those two policy objectives come into tension. And so I think the big question for me, looking not just a year or two ahead, but decades ahead, is how do we protect an internet that is competitive, is open, is not just a series of walled gardens, be they companies or continents, and protects the human rights and the free expression that are the foundation of the internet for many, many, many years to come. And I think the biggest challenge for policymakers is to think that long term, rather than looking at these very complex problems. Let's salami slice them and take one small problem, solve that problem, and then try and solve the next problem. And when you do that, you end up in a situation where we have no clarity of direction, no clarity of mission, but also the second and third order effects of regulation can be really damaging on the open internet.
So this goes back to Eileen's earlier point, and also the point that Casper made, I think, about the importance of protecting a digital domain that is a democratic digital domain, a so-called open internet, and that we ensure that open internet is seen as an asset and not a vulnerability, which I think has been the framing recently, as we've seen, obviously, Russia and China and others try to exploit various online tools, including platforms, to spread all kinds of misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and to influence public opinion across the world. But let me ask you, Nick, you're talking about protecting the internet, not just today, but for the long term. And I think one of the takeaways that I had from the tech executive hearings that happened recently in the US Congress was that, there is no one size fits all model, because the companies provide different services. They have different kinds of user bases. They have different kinds of business models. And even though we heard a lot from the CEO of Amazon, Google, and others, it really didn't come to any sort of, I think, policy consensus, not in the United States, certainly, as to what is to be done here. But let me kind of pivot a little bit and ask you a slightly more provocative question. Is there still an open democratic internet? Obviously, China has the so-called Great Firewall of China. Russia has also been experimenting with a so-called sovereign internet. It's enshrined in Russian law now. Other countries have followed suit. especially during moments of protest, like Iran and others. So are we already in a fragmented internet where the open internet is not the dominant form, perhaps, anymore? And maybe we no longer have something to protect. What do you think about that?
Well, you're absolutely right to say that there are countries who do not share the vision of the open internet being the driver of social and economic progress that we believe it is. And there are more countries who are starting to think about, for their own domestic political interests, how do we shut down the internet at certain times? How do we control the content? And some of those technologies are being provided by different countries, not always the ones you would think of. So I think the open internet is absolutely still the central economic and social force that we see today. I think the question is that it won't be an overnight change. This is going to happen over time. Governments are going to look at this and how they want to pursue their own politics. I think, looking at the Freedom Online Coalition and the work that did, establishing these issues, renewing those efforts is certainly something that I would urge policymakers to put at the heart of their own agendas, recognizing that the benefits that their countries have from the open internet are magnified and amplified by the global nature of the internet. And so state-by-state control doesn't serve that. But I think you are seeing some positive changes as well. For example, looking at how the European Commission is now engaging with the idea of we need to move beyond this idea of is content up or down, and that the question of how many people see content and how it's discovered, how it's amplified, how it's recommended is more important than just is it on the internet or not. And so I think we are seeing policymakers in Europe recognizing this opportunity. But the question for me is, when a country does shut the internet down, what are the consequences? And I think that's something where policymakers around the world still haven't figured out what the toolkit of responses is when people take actions that harms the open internet.
Thanks, Nick. And I want to go back to Ian and Eileen shortly, but before I do that, I just want to remind those of you tuning in and everywhere we're streaming this, if you're on Twitter, appropriately, since we just heard from Nick at Twitter, please use the hashtag CEPA Forum to tweet any questions, and we are collecting those, and we'll try to incorporate them into the discussion going forward. That's hashtag CEPA Forum. So Ian, Eileen, I want to come back to both of you because in some ways, I think both of you were speaking to a similar issue that we've kind of dug into with comments from Casper and Nick. And that has to do with, one, this question of it's nice to talk about values, of course. I think we can all generally agree that transparency is a good thing, accountability is a good thing, and open internet, I think most people would say, is a good thing. But how do we actually go through the business? What do we actually do in practice to ensure that we have that kind of cooperation, at least in the transatlantic space? One thing that Microsoft has done, I think, Casper, I'll give you guys a plug here, which is Microsoft has been one of the companies that has led an international call, the Paris call, that has over 60 companies, governments, probably even more now, signed up in an effort to build consensus around values and principles. The US has not signed up, of course. So does that matter when we're talking about how do we actually get there? How do we actually ensure that the digital authoritarian model that Beijing has been building and investing in doesn't become the norm across the world? How do we get our act together? Ian, let me start with you, and then Eileen, we'll go over to you.
Well, I mean, first, it's not only up to us. And I think historically, these questions, there's a general view that the Americans get to determine what the future order looks like, and it's only if we abdicate that others, sort of show up in our absence. But I mean, China is a technology superpower today, and many of their applications are as cutting edge, in some cases more cutting edge, than those of the Americans. And I don't think that's about to change in the next 5 years. So they're going to have a lot to say too. And as I think about Belt and Road, as I think about the incredible financial stress that many emerging market countries are going to be under in the next 12, 18 months on the back of the pandemic. This is, by the way, the longest that I've gone in any panel in the last 6 months before the pandemic has been mentioned. But let's be clear that the United States right now doesn't seem to want to provide an awful lot of additional support for countries that might need it. The Chinese, on the other hand, could be in a very different position. We both, the United States and China, have decided not to sign on to the COVAX agreement for vaccines. But the Chinese are doing a lot of deals with a lot of poorer countries around the world to ensure that they're able to get Chinese vaccines early. They are exporting their surveillance equipment and a lot of their technology more broadly to a number of countries around the world. So I think that even if the United States and Europe are completely aligned, and we're not, but even if we were, on what we wanted the future of architecture, regulatory policy, taxation, all of these things around tech would be, you would still have a number of countries around the world that would be much more fundamentally aligned with China. So, I mean, I think that we've kind of passed the point of no return on Splinternet. And I think that has more to do with Xi Jinping. So even if Biden wins coming up, I actually think that if Xi Jinping is still there come 2022, and that's not a given, there is some uncertainty around that, then I don't think we can get out of some degree of tech Cold War between these two technology superpowers. On the other hand, I do think there's a lot to play for if Biden becomes president in particular in aligning US and European regulatory policy. Like, I mean, I completely agree with Eileen, like as long as the Europeans don't really have strong technology companies, there's only so much they can do. But the fact that Biden is assertively pro-Europe, while Trump was pro-Brexit, Trump has been pro-Orban, Trump has been pro-Euroscepticism, the fact that a Biden administration will support dramatically higher levels of redistribution and taxation, not only on the 1% and maybe a wealth tax we'll see on Senate, but also on big corporations, and the fact that Biden will be, in my view, stronger on sustainability and environment than Biden, Obama were 4 years ago, that implies to me that the United States and Europe are going to be much more aligned on a host of regulatory issues, and tech will be a big one. So I'm not someone who generally thinks the president matters so much in foreign policy. I think it's usually overstated. And on China, I think they're more aligned than you think. And on the Middle East, on Israel and the UAE and all this stuff more than you think. On Russia, more than you think, whatever Trump says, but he's very constrained. But on Europe, and on tech, I actually think this election matters a lot. And it would facilitate a much faster ramp up towards that type of alignment. I'm very interested in what Eileen has to say.
Yeah, Eileen, just before we head over to you, I'd love to get you to respond to Ian's, I think, very provocative comment that we're past the point of no return when it comes to the so-called Splinternet, and that even in the long term, if we did have a long-term strategic approach like Nick described, as well, that we've already sort of lost the battle here at the global level. I'd love to hear more from you on that point. And I think I'd like to bring in another element into this conversation. And Casper, I'll be looking to you a little later to provide us with a bit more optimism, I think, after Ian's comments just now, especially. But, one of the things that we discussed on the first day of CEPA Forum with a panel on the future of geopolitics. And a couple of the speakers there, Frank Fukuyama and Corey Shockey from AAI, said that one, the US has completely abdicated its leadership role around the COVID crisis. We were getting there, Ian. We're going to talk about COVID for better or for worse. And two, the speakers did seem to agree that the election outcome in the US wouldn't really change things significantly because we're past the point of no return, as Ian said. So I'm going to leave it all to you to answer or respond to any of that. Eileen, over to you.
Okay, too much to talk about here. Top line, I have to say, in the United States, if the if Trump gets reelected, all bets are off and we're all in trouble. I'm just saying it. If Biden is elected, we've got a serious shot, and I 100% agree with Ian that not only will he recommit to Europe and try to rebuild the Transatlantic alliance, he's already called for a democracy summit to pull the democratic world together, and I am fairly confident they must understand digital technology is going to be a central piece of that. On the issue of splinternet, fragmented internet, and Alina, you asked, I think it was Nick, if it's already been splintered, do we have nothing to protect? I would say, yes, it is already splintered. And even if Xi Jinping goes, I think we may never get it back, but we almost have more to fight for, because what we're now fighting for is the dominance of a democratic vision for governance of society writ large. I mean, digitization of society means we're talking about society. The digital agenda is the agenda, and the values in the digital realm are the values. And so either we do find a way to articulate a democratic vision of governance of digital society writ large, or we don't. We fight with each other as this other model really takes traction around the world. That gets to what I think Nick was talking about in terms of values. What I think democratic governments are struggling with is their basic task. Their responsibility is to protect liberty and the security of citizens, and also, by the way, protect the integrity of democratic elections. Those things are in tension. Privacy, he said, privacy is in tension with free expression. Privacy is in tension with need to get information to counter terrorism. Those are the things that governments need to struggle with together in the Democratic Alliance, and we need to find to optimize for those things simultaneously. That has always been the task of democratic government. It is harder in the digital context. Nobody has adjusted, but that's what they need to do. Last little point I will mention is in terms of something concrete, I really do think there's an opportunity to hone in on policies related to transparency and accountability for platforms. And there's been a lot of work done there, because I think that is the first step for governments to understand what's really going on under the hood. If they don't understand how algorithmic promotion and demotion works, they're not going to be able to regulate. And I'm not saying hand over the code. I'm just saying there's got to be a way to communicate so that government regulators get the basics.
Thank you, Eileen. I saw your point now and earlier that we need to first align on a common democratic transatlantic digital policy. And then our China approach and our China strategy will flow from that, because I think it will become very clear that we are on an adversarial stance vis-a-vis China. Ian's follow-up to that was say, well, even if we're aligned, we're still going to find ourselves on the back foot here because we've just been fighting for too long and it's already a little too late. So I'm really delighted to hear you talk a little bit more about what can we take, what kinds of concrete steps can we actually take, even if we are already in a fragmented, splintered internet. That doesn't mean we just lie down and give up, because there's still so much to fight for here. So Casper and Nick, I want to take it over to you. Casper, you started to outline what I think could be sort of a positive way forward on the transatlantic digital agenda, some areas where you saw or you see future cooperation. But I'd like to get you to respond to this notion that Ian laid on the table that's emerged from this conversation about what do we actually do if we already reached a point of no return? And Nick, I'll take it back over to you to follow that and to respond to Eileen. I think she brings up an interesting point that there has been a lot of concrete policy steps taken when it comes to issues around platform transparency and accountability. But what does that actually mean in practice? What does transparency mean, from a industry perspective, from your perspective at Twitter? And Casper, if you want to touch on that as well, be delighted to hear from you. So Casper, let me take it over to you and then Nick.
Thanks very much. it's a bit unusual for me to be on a panel where I'm expected to be the positive person here and optimistic. I normally bring a bit of Nordic noir and pessimism to the debate, but it's, you know, I'm trying to be in the zone of this new role. I appreciate it a lot. Listen, I am more optimistic than Ian, in the sense that I don't think, if we begin with the transatlantic relationship, I don't think it's broken. It goes without saying, we don't have to shy away from the fact that it's certainly constrained right now. And I think there are a lot of European decision makers that are deeply concerned about where the world is heading and also our ability of sticking together. But I'm sure all of you listened in when the European Commission President von der Leyen gave her State of the European Union speech last week. And I thought it was very interesting, you know, just as a small anecdote, she mentioned digital 19 times in that speech. And she actually had a paragraph where she spoke about the transatlantic relationship. And I very much see that as sort of her reaching out, even in times of political turmoil, and saying, you know, we have a value dimension across the Atlantic that is fundamental. It's stronger than just a couple of years of political turmoil. And I saw her sort of trying to express to sort of counterparts in the US, Europe's real desire and interest in making sure we stick together, not least based on values, the protection of democracy, human rights. I think privacy is, you know, the difference between the approach to privacy, I think personally is sometimes overstated between Europe and the US. Is very often we have this sort of distinction between privacy and national security, and it's often portrayed as though Europe is only focused on privacy and the US is only focused on national security. I think there are a lot of more nuances in that debate, although the regulatory dimension of it, the policy aspect of that debate unfolds differently in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels. But let me try and be optimistic and positive, so that's what you want me to be on this. You know, you can say very, very little good about COVID-19. But I think, you know, when you look at Europe, we were potentially looking at 60 million unemployed people because of COVID-19. It has hit very unevenly across Europe. So in general, the more digitalized countries have done better because of the enormous dependency on, you know, education, being able to work online, using some of the technologies, including the technologies that Microsoft is providing. And I think the conclusion or the perception of this is slightly schizophrenic in Europe. To some extent, there's a lot of gratitude. And I think it's so important to remember that I think we would have been in a lot more trouble, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago without having access to the technologies we have today. And I really think our economy would have been in a very bad stage. I think we would have lost many more jobs today. The flip side of the coin is, of course, this dependency, which is certainly the perception in Europe as well, that why is it not European companies that are providing, you know, the video technology that would enable us to talk together today. And I think that sort of schizophrenic approach is actually an opportunity for us also to build stronger relationship across the Atlantic. And I would just point to one aspect of digitalization, that is the vulnerability in terms of cyber attacks that unfortunately also follows with what we're seeing across Europe. You know, a lot of people have said we probably had 2 years of digitalization taking place in 2 months. I think for some of us, it felt like 2 weeks, and we're not at the end of it yet. But I actually think one area where there's, you know, fantastic collaboration is around cybersecurity. And I think that is an area where there is a common external threat, regardless of whether we're talking about criminal networks or whether we're talking about state actors. There is a feeling that we have to invest more in this, that we have to create multi-stakeholder frameworks, bringing together not least the US and Europe around this agenda. So I would just point to that as being one area where I think there are a lot of opportunities. But again, I think we almost need to map out areas where future governments of the US and future governments in Europe, the EU institutions can actually cooperate on digital and technology issues. It's not as bad, I think, sitting here in Brussels as it sometimes looks when you follow the debate.
This is actually one of our questions from the audience that I was planning to bring in. That you already spoke to, Casper, and that was about the effects of the COVID pandemic, where on the one hand, it has, I think, exposed a lot of perhaps grievances or conflicts between countries or individuals and the large companies, platforms, et cetera, on which all of us depend to now do our work, to telework, et cetera. And on the other hand, the fact that we are now transmitting a huge amount more data online, and it also exposes a lot of vulnerabilities because of that. And we weren't really built for this global social experiment to just turn on the way that it did because of a crisis event. And the question that comes from the audience is, what should international institutions prioritize when it comes to protecting, securing the information environment from adversaries? Casper, since you started talking about this, let me give you a second if you can respond to that quickly. What will be a top priority that you would suggest putting on the table when it comes to protecting our information online? And then I want to take it back over to Nick, and then I'll have a couple of questions for all of you, depending on who wants to chime in. So Casper,
okay,
please.
I'll try and be very quick. Listen, I think there's a lot of focus on what is happening at the UN track, and I know Ian and others have been involved in the General Assembly this week. So trying to create sort of the traffic rules in cyberspace through norms in the UN, super important. A lot of focus on multi-stakeholder frameworks. As you mentioned at the beginning, we've been heavily involved in the Paris Peace Forum, the Paris Call, trying to sort of ensure that both the private sector and the public sector comes together and finding ways to defend ourselves against cyber attacks. In my view, there are two things that I think we need to become better at, and that is actually connecting, I would say, the technical defensive side. And this is perhaps where there is a difference between 2020 and even 10 or 20 years ago, because today technology companies are first-line responders to many of these cyber attacks. So therefore, I fundamentally believe that governments cannot do it alone. We have to make sure that there is collaboration with the private sector in order to raise the best possible defense. But then if you allow me to zoom out a little bit, I think we have a lot of focus on Europe, we have a lot of focus on the US. I think we need a lot more focus on developing economies. There is a geopolitical angle to that, but I think, the digital divide certainly also exists in cybersecurity. And I think we have to invest more in capacity building. We have to make sure that we increase also the defensive capabilities of countries or companies in developing economies. And I think that's sort of the next phase, something we hope will come out of the Paris Call this year. It was a lot more than 1 second, but I was really trying to make it as quick as possible. My apologies for being long.
No, thank you. Thank you, Casper. Nick, let me take it over to you to respond to anything that's been put on the table. I won't put you on the spot too much. I think you've been used to getting put on the spot quite often by congressional members and others have been grilling you. This is not one of those situations. So, but, on the transparency question, that Eileen brought up, that Casper's been talking about, what does that actually mean? Casper mentioned the need for public-private partnerships to take a more global view. Ian also mentioned the increasingly critical role of emerging economies, the global south, et cetera. Comment anything you want there, but I do think it'd be interesting to hear from you on, what does it actually mean, let's say for Twitter to become a quote unquote more transparent company, which we often hear that retort from policymakers across the Atlantic. But what does that actually mean in practice?
It's a really hard question. And I think you have to start from a place which is transparency isn't an end in itself. I think a lot of people see transparency as something that you do and then you move on from. Transparency should enable things. And so if you take, for example, we took the decision as a company to publish the archives of every tweet, every meme, every video that we've removed and we believe was linked to a nation state conducting an information operation. So that archive now runs to several terabytes of data, hundreds of millions of tweets, and is publicly accessible at transparency.twitter.com. That transparency delivers data. It doesn't deliver understanding. And that's where our partnerships, whether it's with the Stanford Cyber Center, ASPI in Australia, organizations like Demos, the Atlantic Council, who are using this data to then help explain the tactics, the tradecraft of information operations, which then enables governments to respond, civil society to respond at a strategic level. And so I think you asked for one of the things that I think we still need to invest in and address urgently. I think COVID has exposed the fact that the communications environment that we all live in has changed beyond recognition in the past 5-10 years. And I think one of the challenges for governments is that they look at that communications landscape and still see one that's dominated by newspapers and television and radio. And so whether it's looking at hostile information operations, the kind of information activity conducted around MH17 or on the Skripal poisonings, the need to communicate more, and whether it's public diplomacy or public education about health risks, I think governments still haven't adapted fully to the environment. And this was something I spoke about in the context of the early days of IS, in the context of post-2016 geopolitics, the need for governments to actually look at technology companies not just as industries to be regulated, but tools to conduct government and to educate and to persuade and to communicate. And so I do think we still have a risk of information vacuums on social media platforms being left by governments who are not communicating in a way that reflects the modern environment. And so as a result, bad actors, be they foreign or domestic, and I think that's a distinction that's increasingly irrelevant, are able to take advantage of these vulnerabilities in the communications ecosystem to propagate information for their own ends and indeed their own revenue. So my takeaway is actually some of these problems look like tech problems when you start out and end up being actually things about labor regulation, about tax, about how governments use communications, period. And so I think that my driving thought is often when I'm in a conversation about transparency or regulation, it's to say, well, what's the public policy problem we're trying to solve? And is it one of technology or is it one of society? And if we can try drive that conversation, I think we can make much more progress.
Yeah, it's an interesting point to get us to think about the bigger picture. Now I want to pose a couple of questions to anyone who wants to chime in. I think there's been an issue we've been dancing around a bit as we have talked about the splinternet, fragmented, balkanized internet, whatever you want to call it, and this notion of digital sovereignty. Eileen, you mentioned the idea of digital authoritarianism, of course, that is very much associated with what Beijing is doing at home and increasingly trying to export abroad, a sort of surveillance state based on the exploitation of technologies. But digital sovereignty, I think, has become this contentious issue. It's a term that we hear used in Europe a lot, but it's also a term that Russia, and to a certain extent, I think China has adopted to justify some of these efforts to try to balkanize the internet. So whoever wants to chime in, what is digital sovereignty exactly? And is it a good thing for us to be talking about within the transatlantic digital agenda?
I can jump in there. I would start by saying it's understandable that there is a desire to reinforce this concept of digital sovereignty in Europe based on everything that has happened. Very understandable. I think it's also really unfortunate, and I think it is directionally going in, it's just the wrong direction, at the very time when the United States and Europe should be banding together, sharing data, sharing technology, and sharing governance norms. So the idea that Europe becomes independent, self-sufficient with respect to some basics, I get it, but I think in practice it will have the wrong effect in terms of what we really need, which is this much stronger alliance. And it has the unfortunate effect of reinforcing this concept that China has been pressing for a long time on internet sovereignty, which to me is ultimately about the idea that whatever happens in our boundaries, which are now digital, it's none of your business. And we don't get external critique on a human rights basis, let's say. And so obviously that's not the intention of the Germans and others, but that is one of the effects. I have to come back to the transparency thing, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. I just want to say, I think this idea, it sounds so boring. And as Nick said, it's not an end in itself. But I think it's a much richer concept. It's ultimately about helping citizens understand what it means to live in a digitized realm, in an algorithmically driven information realm. And I think that there are proposals on the table that, the Transatlantic High-Level Working Group on Content Moderation and Free Expression, great paper on this, where there's three levels. The first is transparency for users about rules, content-based rules, like when will this stuff be taken down, and complaint mechanisms to empower them. Second level is for transparency for governments in terms of performance on execution of those rules. Are the companies doing what they promised? Basic accountability. And the third level is much more the gray zone for most people, which is what are the decision rules and algorithms and how does it affect what we see? And I think that's the part that's so mysterious to non-technologists. And that's what we need to better understand for everybody to come up to speed.
Thanks, Eileen. Ian, do you want to jump in there? You brought up the point of no return, that we're already in the splinter net. Is digital sovereignty the right way to be thinking about how to build a more coherent approach? Or, as Eileen said, does it actually have more negative effects in terms of justifying potentially the Russian and Chinese view of the world, which we're trying to push against?
It's clearly the wrong way, but I understand why it's happening. I think that we have to understand that for the last, say, 50 years, almost every good story globally out there has in some way been linked to people, goods, capital, ideas, and data moving faster and faster across borders. And that means more shared values. That means more shared governance. It means more globalization. Now, I don't think that there's a tipping point on globalization writ large. You saw when the Saudis and the Russians got into a fight on oil production, and potentially with the US too, they had to back off of that real fast because OPEC as a cartel doesn't mean anything much anymore. It's become decentralized. It's become more efficient. It's become more global, dare I say. And when I think about lots of manufacturing and services too. I think in 5 years' time, the NBA will still think of China as its most important external market. I think that most universities in the US will still think of Chinese as the students that are most important to paying full freight to ensure that their budgets stay in place. If I walk down the street in the West Village and I go to Sotheby's, I still think that all the high-end literature for houses and lofts will be in English and in Mandarin. So I don't think that's changing. I don't think we're heading to a Thucydides trap. I don't think we're heading to a Cold War. But I think the idea that values somehow are continuing to move towards open society and liberal democracy in the information space, in the data space, I don't see it. And I think digital sovereignty is one of the manifestations of the fact that that's not happening. And I'm not just talking, in part, I'm talking about Russia being in decline and angry about it and coming after the West and trying to use their data and cyber capabilities and misinformation capabilities to delegitimize our institutions and somewhat effectively, right? That's part of it. And part of it is the fact that the Chinese government, certainly under Xi Jinping, is consolidating state capitalism and technology as the most important strategic sector. But perhaps most importantly is the fact that in our own United States, it's not clear that we continue to embrace true transparency. It's not clear that we really embrace a representative and open democracy that is not rigged for many of its people. And I'm not just talking about the election here. This is so much deeper than that. So if that's true, if in 5 or 10 years' time, if we're going to move towards our technology firms as being the most strategically important, the national champions, where, even 5 years ago, you go to Silicon Valley, and it's libertarianism. It's, we just want to have good products for everybody. We don't deal with government, right? Microsoft was never quite like that because it's more B2B and it's more institutionalized. But certainly the Facebooks, the Googles, the Twitters, those organizations were born out of that crucible. I think that is a really big difference in how we think about the future of not just technology and data, but of our society. And maybe I'll close with one question, which I think is very easily answered. I think if you ask the average American if they would prefer to have their civil society degraded by TikTok or by Facebook, they would choose Facebook. Now, I think that's the right answer. But the fact that it's a choice makes it harder to set up the kind of institutional norms and regulatory structure that will help ensure that Facebook is not degrading civil society in our country. And by the way, I do think that Facebook is degrading civil society in our country right now. I think it's a serious problem. I think Twitter's less of a problem, but also is a problem. And they're very aware of it. I think other companies too. But that's the problem. If we're entering into this fight where the other companies that are really good are ones that truly are a structural problem, not just for issues of privacy and civil society, but for the national security of our very society, then obviously if you're Mark Zuckerberg, you're going to say, hey, you've got me or you've got China, who are you picking? And he's done that very effectively in Congress, in my view. So we'll see where we get.
Thanks, Dean. We have a couple of minutes left. There was a lot there, I think, that others on the panel could respond to, should respond to.
I was very well behaved for the first 50 minutes, and I saw that was boring. So I felt like you needed something, you know.
We needed something, Ian. That's why you're here, to give us that something. So thank you for that. I will say that on an optimistic note, perhaps, we have seen a pretty profound change in how even the companies that you mentioned that have come of age in this sort of crucible of the wild west of the free internet have changed their pivot. Even I think Facebook has, to a certain extent. I don't want to beat up on a company that's not here to represent its views, but even this discussion that we're having today, where we have representatives from industry, you from the private sector, Eileen from the research community, and we're able to talk about these issues across the Atlantic space, I think is symbolic of how far we've actually come over the last 6 years. There's a lot more we still need to do, obviously, and I think you defined the problem as always, quite correctly, Ian. We have just a little bit of time left. I want to give everyone on the panel just a quick opportunity for a short 30-second closing comments, any takeaways that you'd like our audience to stay with as a result of this discussion. And let me just go backwards. Nick, you're up first.
Thanks. I'll do my best to stick to 30 seconds. For me, I think one of the challenges that we just touched on there is some of these problems aren't new. Questions around digital sovereignty are in part driven by successive governments around the world failing to reform the MLAT system so that governments can exchange evidence that relates to technology companies quickly. Twitter's decision to ban political adverts was in part reflective of the fact that governments around the world have failed to regulate political adverts in the online space. And so the decision's left to tech companies. So my big kind of hope for 2021 is that we actually start looking beyond the short-term political pressures, short-term policy objectives, think long-term, protect the open internet as a foundational value of democratic society and the modern economy, and then build from there in a multi-stakeholder way. I think we can do a lot of good, and I'm still optimistic with Casper. The open internet has not passed us by, but we have to fight for it.
That was an optimistic note. Casper, let me give you a quick intervention. Eileen, I think we'll close it out with you to have the final word.
Okay, well, perhaps let me give sort of a suggestion to the US and a suggestion to Europe afterwards. I think to the US, when we talk about this digital sovereignty debate, that is to acknowledge that it's a legitimate debate, that it's a real debate, and it ain't going to disappear in the next couple of years. I think it's about privacy. I think it's about national security, and it's also about economic opportunity. And I think the basis for actually creating a bridge between the US and Europe is acknowledging that this is a relevant discussion that applies also for the private sector. Now, for Europe, I think the flip side of the coin is, of course, to avoid that this ends up in protectionism and the raising of new walls. So I think, similarly to what Nick said, let's make sure that companies are not judged on the basis of where they come from, but rather how they operate. And I think that's the responsibility that the tech industry has. If we misbehave, no wonder that European decision makers will fall back to regulation as the default.
Thanks, Casper. And Eileen, final word.
So I will say, someone just said, I guess it was Nick, talking about governments have failed in many ways in non-digital spaces. And so a lot of the problems we have to say are relate to the government itself. I would say that we have turned to the private sector much more. And the one push I would make there is companies should much more explicitly and proactively commit to democratic values and human rights values, because they are having such gargantuan effects on every realm of society. And so I would say it's not all on the private sector at all. In fact, I really think we need governments to step back up to their actual obligations to society, which they've failed in. But everybody needs to do it through a democratic values lens much more proactively.
Thank you, Eileen. Happy to see that we're able to end on a somewhat optimistic note, despite our initial pessimism here. Clearly, this is a discussion we could have go on for a very long time. I just want to thank Ian Bremer, Eileen Donahoe, Casper Klinge, and Nick Pickles for this really lively and provocative discussion. Thanks for joining the CEPA Forum. And with that, I want to thank again our partners in making CEPA Forum possible. That is Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Nato Public Diplomacy Division, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Bell Helicopter, and the American Friends of the Czech Republic. So stay tuned, and thank you.
We need strong alliances in Europe to give us the broadest possible political and economic base with which to compete with China.
The work that began in the wake of 2014 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and illegal annexation of Crimea, in terms of the European reassurance work that then was transformed into the deterrence work.
Senators Portman and Murphy are committed transatlanticists who embody visionary, bipartisan leadership.
We have to form close partnerships with allies who share our values, and that's going to be critical, having a global anti-disinformation network.
I believe the biggest task of the transatlantic community will be to defend democracy in the face of unprecedented challenges from countries like Russia and China.